Welcome back from the break. Now we will move on to our next case, a clinical BA/BE case study with Dr. Doug Pham. Dr. Pham is the Associate Director for Clinical Policy in OSIS. He received a pharmacy degree from Oregon State University and his law degree from University of Oregon. Dr. Pham recently joined OSIS after 10 years in CDER's Office of Compliance and is currently focused on developing and improving the clinical BA/BE inspection program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pham.
Hi everybody, my name is Doug Pham and I'm the Associate Director of Clinical Policy in the Office of Study Integrity and Surveillance. I'm a bit of an OSIS newbie and come from CDER's Office of Compliance where I spent over a decade working on BIMA compliance and enforcement matters. One of my primary focuses in this new role with OSIS is to help improve upon what it means to properly conduct a clinical trial of bioavailability and bioequivalent studies for submission to the FDA. With that in mind, we're going to lay the foundation for good clinical practice by talking about documentation. As in, what does it mean and why it's tremendously important to us at the FDA. Many approach discussing documentation by describing how one would do it or what documents you have to have at your site or clinical trial site. But I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. Today we're going to look at it from FDA's perspective. What it means when you have missing or inconsistent documentation during an inspection, and how that improper documentation can impact data reliability and acceptability from any of the data that's been generated at your clinical trial site. As a reminder, this presentation is a reflection of my own personal views and do not represent FDA's official position or policy. For today's learning objectives, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of FDA's Bio Research Monitoring or BIMO program, briefly talk on the specific aspects of the BIMO Compliance Program 7348.003, and as mentioned earlier, examine the importance of documentation at a clinical trial site as it relates to data integrity through the lens or the perspective of an FDA inspection. So, just a little bit of background. FDA's BIMO program is a comprehensive program of on-site inspections and data audits. It was designed to monitor all aspects of regulated research. In reality, however, the BIMO program was created to essentially address two huge problems, or issues. First, to assure the quality and integrity of data submitted to the agency in support of applications. And second, to provide protection for the rights and welfare of human subjects involved in FDA-regulated research. There are currently 11 BIMO compliance programs, or CPs, and they span from IRBs to clinical investigators to in vivo bioanalytical and bioequivalent studies. For us today, we're just going to focus on a few parts of the in vivo BA/BE clinical studies under program 7348.003. Please keep in mind that these CPs provide instructions to FDA personnel for conducting compliance activities. For everybody else, it's a really compelling document that lets you see, it lets outside folks see what we tell our internal folks. These CPs are a great way to get a sense of the compliance standards for any given compliance program. In a sense, it's a roadmap for how we approach inspections and what we plan to look for. So it would behoove you to take a good look at all these documents if it relates to what you're doing at your site. Compliance Program 7348.003 includes 11 components. And I believe that yesterday we had a few OSIS colleagues providing an overview of each component with specific focus to randomization and reserve samples. As mentioned earlier, we're going to go a different path and focus on the importance of documentation, especially as it relates to different parts of the subject source record, as well as records related to the collection, processing, and storage of study samples. Before we take a deep dive into CP, let's talk a little bit about what documentation or why it's so important. For those of us in the FDA, documentation at a site is the cornerstone of how we reconstruct studies, assess study conduct at individual clinical trial sites, and determine data integrity as well as data acceptability as part of our application review. Without overstating things, complete and proper documentation means absolutely everything. So remember that we're going to talk about two aspects of documentation. The first is what type of documentation that should be available and retained at a clinical trial site during an FDA inspection. And then with our case studies, the second aspect that we're going to talk about is how missing or inconsistent documentation may impact the reliability and the acceptability of the data generated at your site. All right, specific to subject records. There should be documentation to demonstrate that a subject met eligibility criteria, especially showing inclusion and exclusion criteria. Accurate, timely reporting of adverse or serious adverse events when they occur, and whether enrolled subjects are real, alive, and actively participating in the study. One thing about subject eligibility, it's really important to have all the medical records to show that a subject has met all inclusion criteria. Without the records to show that each criteria was met, the assumption is that they have not met them until we see the records. For each of these record types, we're looking at records organization, condition, accessibility, and completeness. Essentially Alcoa standards for those of you who are familiar with that. Also in subject records, we are looking for documentation demonstrating appropriate and complete informed consents, as well as any nuances or conditions imposed by the IRB. We will also be on the lookout for other records that are important to the study, such as administrative files, correspondent files, financial agreements, and other things like transfer obligation agreements between two different parties. When it comes to the documentation of study samples, we'd like to see source records that document how samples were collected, processed, and stored in accordance with study protocol and applicable SOPs. The record and documentation of the data, like time points or deviations, etc., are tremendously important because it speaks to the integrity of the sample themselves. The depiction here is to help delineate the flow of subject samples, especially the contrast between the clinical and the analytical areas. While there may be some crossover between the two, we typically are looking for dosing, sample collection, and processing documentation when inspecting a clinical site, and not really any information as it relates to blood sample bioanalysis. So now let's explore why documentation is really important as we consider some case study. For our first case study, let's assume that your site is conducting a randomized, open-label, crossover, multi-center, pivotal in vivo BA study with a PK endpoint. Your site is responsible for PK collection and processing at the initial time points after dosing. Your site was provided relevant sample collection and processing forms to use, and your site enrolled 32 subjects in the study. Okay, now let's assume FDA showed up unannounced and made some initial observations, which include all subjects enrolled had document to show that they all met all eligibility requirements, so that's a win. The documentation for specific subjects, however, regarding PK collection and processing showed that some data were either missing or were inconsistent. For 14 subjects, there were at least one data element missing. For 8 subjects, there were multiple missing data elements within either a single visit or the same data element across multiple visits. The pictorial to your right here demonstrates some examples. The first red box shows that the collection time was conducted outside of the window and was missing an explanation or comment. The second box or red box shows a missing centrifuge time or centrifuge stop time and condition. And the third red box shows the time to freezer as prior to the actual centrifuge start time. And finally, the fourth red box shows a sample shipping date of January 1st, 2023. That is before the study visit date of January 2nd, 2023. As we think about the issues, please consider the following. Are we able to reconstruct the study by given the documentation issues? Would you be comfortable in relying on the data collected at the site? Let's pause for a few minutes and talk through some of these issues. Okay, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and I just want to talk through this first initial case study. So the two questions posed were pretty broad, but let's kind of talk through the issues. In the first one, I'm going to try to pan through the slides a little bit here. In the first issue, the first question is, can we reconstruct the study? So, and this question is actually pretty tough in a sense, because you've enrolled 32 subjects, almost half you're missing something within each subject, right, record file, and then almost a third of it you're missing. You have multiple missing data points within their subject records. So, give and take. We understand. Everyone understands that there is some human errors. There's people do a lot of work at these clinical trial sites, and you're really busy, so their errors are going to happen. But when it comes to kind of the multitude, the diverseness of this, of the findings initially at this in this first case study, it's kind of demonstrates a little bit of a pattern practice of something's not going right at this site, right? So yeah, and I've noticed that some of you in the chat have said no or incomplete data, and I would agree with you. And I guess the second question is, can you rely on the data generated at the site? And what I would ask you is contemplate whether would you rely on the data generated for this particular study. In addition, would you rely on the data generated at this site as a whole? Those are two separate analyses, but something to kind of think about. Okay, so to me though, and let's kind of talk through it. So from a particular specific to the study, because the diverse nature and the kind of the multitude and the vast number associated with the missing data elements and the inconsistent data elements from one's record to another, it would be really tough to rely on the data at this particular site for this particular study. So that's pretty easy. But the question is, could you translate issues or findings for this particular study to how the site conducts any study throughout its kind of life cycle or duration that it's been doing study? And I think that's a harder question, and that's where a lot of our inspections we not only look at one, we may look at another study to see that not only if there's a pattern practice within one study, but we're also looking to see if there's pattern practice associated with multiple studies. And that's kind of a way that we can see whether it can be attributed to the entire site, or it may just be an isolated thing to this particular study and a particular set of study coordinators. You know what I mean? And I see that your comments, yeah, I mean, there's kind of a wide spectrum study for sure. And some are saying site-wide. And there is a comment about that you could isolate, because, I mean, this is the other aspect that you have to really contemplate what are the missing or what are the kind of inconsistent data elements. Like, what are they? How important are they to the study? And how important are they for you to reconstruct the entire study? And those kind of factor in how you contemplate, or how the effect of it is going to impact your analysis on reliability and acceptability. Okay, I think that was great. Let's move on to the second case study. Okay, now that we've talked through some of the issues and the concerns, here are the final takeaways from this first case study. First, without accurate documentation, it's really difficult to reconstruct the conditions regarding the samples during the collection and processing phase. Second, given the magnitude and the scope of documentation issues here in this case, we would have some serious data and data reliability concerns, especially with those specific subjects with missing or inconsistent data elements. There would be some red flags as well as to the consideration of any study generated at this site. given the widespread issues for this particular inspected study. Okay, for the next case, or case study number 2, let's operate with the same conditions. You've got a BA study with a PK endpoint, and your clinical site is responsible for PK sample collection and processing at initial time points. So now FDA is at your doorstep again, and they make the initial observations. Again, PK sample collection processing data were missing or inconsistent, similar to case study 1. You have 14 subjects with at least one missing or inconsistent data element. You have 8 subjects that contain either multiple missing data points in the same visit or across multiple visits. However, and here's the big caveat, it was later discovered that the clinical staff actually used a different set of forms to collect the data. It would seem that the missing or inconsistent data on the sponsored or CRO provided forms were due to transcription errors when transferring info from the original source documents. The original forms did not contain any missing or inconsistent data elements. As we think about the issues, please consider the following. Are we able to reconstruct the study given the documentation issues? Would you be comfortable in relying on the data collected at the site? Let's pause for a few minutes and talk through some of these concerns.
Okay, so now we've got the same scenario, right? But whole new twist. We've uncovered or discovered that the site was actually using a wholly different set of CRFs or source documentation to record all the records or the data elements, and then they had issues because there was a sponsor or a CRO kind of form that they were supposed to use but didn't use, and they translated or transcribed all those into the kind of the required form by the CRO. But by doing so, there are some issues. So I guess going back to the first question, in this case study, could you reconstruct the study? And I'm looking and I see lots of yeses, some no's, and lots of reasons why. Okay, yeah, you guys you're getting right at the issues of it, right? I think at least for us, when we're inspecting, we have conversations with all the folks at the site, right? And if you hear weird stories of how they do stuff, if you talk to them, the actual staff that are doing all the work, they say they've been using all these forms consistently, and this is truly this way. And you can talk to all sorts of kind of folks at the site, and if you're getting kind of a authentic message that was kind of performed, you might feel a little bit better that the original source records that were used were correct. But I think, like as everybody's identified here, the really biggest question is, yeah, you could reconstruct it, but it all comes back to, can you rely or are you comfortable with the original source records now that you're aware that there is an original source set, right, that is great, looks good, but then there's this other source set or transcribed source set that's kind of shady and kind of all mixed up and messy, right? So it's a reliability, or I would call it, are you able to be comfortable? Are you able to authenticate and make sure that the original source records are complete, organized? I mean, it's just your comfortability with the original source records. And if you're comfortable with that, then yes, you can reconstruct the data. But if you're not, then it's a no. And I guess the other bigger question here is, I think I would have a major question outside of that analysis is, why did this even occur in the first place? And I think that's a process issue for the particular site. Why are you using one source record and then trying to move it over to the other? Or, what happened there? What caused the mix-up? And moving to our second question, would you be okay to rely on the study data, right? And I think we've kind of answered this already. It all is dependent on whether or how comfortable you are with the original source record. Okay, awesome. You guys are great. I mean, this is the most I've seen all day. So I know we're moving pretty quickly because you guys are just totally on par. But let's go to the next case study.
Okay, now that we've talked through the issues, here are a few takeaways for the case study number 2. First, in this second case, we're able to reconstruct the site using the original source documents, so it seems that data integrity has remained intact. Second, we would be really concerned about how the study was conducted and the processes that led to the site initially showing missing and inconsistent data. We would really contemplate a number of possible options to ensure that this would be corrected and prevented in the future. Okay, for our final case study, we're going to take the same setup. You've got a BAA study with PK endpoint, and your clinical site is responsible for PK sample collection and processing at the initial time points. For this case, we have different initial observations. First, 3 out of 32 subjects are missing documentation to show that they were eligible to be enrolled in the study. Second, 5 out of 32 subjects are missing signed and completed informed consents. Otherwise, everything else looks good. As we think about the issues, let's consider the same following questions. Are we able to reconstruct the study given the documentation issues? Would you be comfortable in relying on the data collected at the site? Let's pause for a few minutes and talk through.
Okay.
After talking through some of the issues, here are a few takeaways in this case study number 3. First, missing documentation to show subject eligibility is really concerning because how do we know whether a subject should have been enrolled in the first place?
So I'm not sure what happened, but it looks like they kind of jumped ahead on the recording. But let's talk about case study number 3. So here we have kind of a wholly different issue, right? The first 2 case studies were kind of talking about actual data collected, whether it's or like data collected, and it's data elements are recorded, the time, all that stuff. It's very specific. Here we're talking about a little bit more of kind of a broad base, higher level, I would say maybe, but it doesn't really speak to a specific data point, right? But here it begs the question on data reliability, data acceptability, and now we're talking about human subject protections, about safety and welfare, because we have consenting issues and we have eligibility issues, right? So the first, and I'm just kind of looking at your comments, and they're all very good. First, you have 3 subjects that are missing essentially past medical histories to show eligibility. This is a big no-no, at least from the clinical trial perspective, because if you can't show that someone is eligible to be in the trial, they probably shouldn't be, right? If you're missing the records, that's a pretty big issue. And I think the question with this one, though, is because it's 3 subjects out of 32, would you, the question that we always kind of contemplate is, do you reject or cut out the data for the 3 subjects, or do you reject the data or the entire study for this particular study? And that is always kind of up in the air, and it kind of depends on kind of what led to the issues. If you can figure that out, is it more broad spectrum? Does it impact other things? If you don't have records to show eligibility, are you missing records for other things too, right? That we haven't contemplated or haven't had a chance to look at. But it really begs the question that there are big issues. But that's something you have to dig in and take a look. The other question, though, well, I mean, let's back up. So with the 3 subjects that are ineligible, I mean, we're dealing with first, I mean, it's tremendous human subject protection issues, right? And 2, the eligibility is questioned, meaning that they should not have been enrolled, and those are both HSP issues, but also from a data perspective, those folks should not be in there, and the data shouldn't be included as part of the analysis. But then again, like I said, do you just do those 3 versus the entire study? The second issue that's kind of in play here is the missing informed consents. I think there was 5 that were noted here, and this is a big deal because we're talking about human subject protections, right? They shouldn't be enrolled until you have a completed and appropriately consented subject before you can get randomized and get into treatment, all that stuff. But it's an interesting take, though, because yes, we do have HSP issues, but what does it mean in accordance to the study data, right? 5, I mean, if you just do it from a more objective perspective, 5 out of 32, hey, it's a good chunk, but it's on that line. If you had 1, I would say it's probably human error, some issues with the site. They may have just dropped the ball. If you had 10, yeah, that's a big deal because then you're seeing, consistency or pervasiveness throughout the site, right? And so, the harder question, though, is if you go back to these original 2 questions, can you reconstruct the study? Maybe, depending on what other things you're finding at the site. And then the second question is, would you be comfortable? And that's kind of maybe as well, because it depends on other things that you see at the site. What things that they're doing at the site that would make you feel good about everything, right? Their processes, their SOPs, their compliance to the protocol in all the other areas versus this is just one missing piece, both the eligibility question and informed consent. But as you look, there's other missing pieces, dropping the ball on data collection, they're missing visits. So it just all depends on what you're seeing. And I've seen this both ways when it comes from an application review where we've relied on some, maybe pieces, we may have relied on all of it, just depending on what the impact of the study, or we've rejected it. So it's gone either way. But it just really is important to kind of survey and take a look at the entire site. So, and I'm taking a look. I mean, you guys' comments are awesome. I mean, it's great. Yeah, very good. I mean, we're talking about carving out the data, the ineligible subjects. We're also talking about, the informed consent issues, whether those are in or out, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, you guys are totally, I mean, these kind of questions and concerns that you guys are flagging right here in the comment is actually what we do every single day, both in an inspection and also on the review side. We're contemplating all these kind of issues as we interpret study reliability or data reliability and acceptability. Okay, I think that's all. Let's move on to the next slide.
Reconstruct the study given the documentation issues. Would you be comfortable in relying on the data collected at the site? Let's pause for a few minutes and talk through. After talking through some of the issues, here are a few takeaways in this case study number 3. First, missing documentation to show subject eligibility is really concerning because how do we know whether a subject should have been enrolled in the first place? Not only is this concerning from the data integrity and acceptability for those specific subjects, it is also concerning from a human subject protection standpoint. Also, missing informed consent documents is really concerning as well as it relates to human subject protections. We would really consider a number of options to ensure that both appropriate corrective actions for these issues have occurred and how best to ensure compliance in the future. So we finally reached the end of our talk today. It's been an absolute pleasure to cover some aspects about our clinical BA/BE program. But I'd like to leave you some last or parting words. First, documentation is critical. Second, missing or inadequate documentation may have a negative impact on data acceptability and data integrity, raise concerns about how a trial has been conducted at your clinical trial site, as well as raise concerns about human subject protections at your clinical trial site. Lastly, remember that CP 7348.003 is a gold mine of information. Use it to your advantage, especially as you prepare for future FDA inspections. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. I believe we have a few minutes, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, so I wasn't intending to fly through like we did, but you guys did such a sweet job about kind of addressing the issues, and so we kind of moved on really quickly, and I apologize for that. I think I should have probably done more cases to kind of exemplify some of the issues that we contemplate every day, especially on inspection and on case review. But I'm wide open right now. So any questions that you have, and I apologize. This kind of topic is really simplified, but it's really an important piece for why we do what we do, right? And I think for me being new to OSIS, it's a great starting point. But I think I would say I look forward to doing more complex, more interesting issues in the future. So the first question I see is for the missing eligibility. If you went back and determined that they met eligibility, and then you were able to collect documents like past medical history and all that stuff to show that they were in fact eligible, that would, in a sense, help kind of ameliorate kind of the concerns that we have with the documentation issue, right? Because it would, in a sense, show that because I know that the lack of documentation would show that you're ineligible, but you found documentation later on, and it shows that you're good to go. So I think that would kind of make us feel a lot better, and that happens a lot. And I think especially with a lot of protocols where you have to dig and kind of, especially the more difficult IND type, studies in phase 3 trials where there are defined parameters of what you have to have to be enrolled for eligibility, diagnosis criteria. So it does happen, and we do understand that you can go back and find it because it may be a lot of information. I apologize. I'm just reading just as much as you guys are. How concerned would FDA be for other trials conducted at the same time for this particular site? So most times when we conduct an inspection, we're looking at past studies, right? Completed studies for the majority of the time. Sometimes they're happening currently as we walk in the door, but most times they're dated, and so we try to look at that one or the one that we're interested in. We'll look at others in different timeframes, and maybe a current one. It just depends on kind of the time that's available and then the issues that we're uncovering. But I think what I would say is the same analysis applies, right? Whether you look at one study or another study, depending on the time frame, whether it's current or it's in a different window, you still look at the pattern practice that's both within that particular study, as well as if it's being affected or found in other studies. And I think the time frame does play in a sense to help us kind of look at the window of time. If there's a certain person that is working in that window of time, there's lots of things to contemplate, but I wouldn't say it's as important as you would think. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, I'm just reading too. There's a whole bunch. So if there's a very low concentration in observed particular subject data, can this subject data be eliminated during a PK analysis if during investigation a valid reason is identified? Maybe. I think you have to separate two things, right? One is that, yeah, we can do a lot of different things based on what we're finding at the inspection and the interpretation of whether that data is reliable or not. But I think the other thing that we also look at is the conduct of the site, right? And that's something we do contemplate from an enforcement perspective and a compliance perspective. How can we help the site do better? And that's where it's really important to kind of assess both what has happened and how they mitigate it and correct it, and how to, like CAPA plans or how they're going to prevent this from occurring in the future. But then stepping away from that, what does this mean in totality for data reliability and data acceptability? They're both connected, but they can also be segregated in kind of an analysis. I see a comment here that that there's I think GLP question that's coming up here. I think studies conducted for the use should be conducted following GLP. So GLP is totally different than what we're talking about in BEBA clinical. They're under different regulations, and I wouldn't blend them at all, if that helps in your understanding. Do you look at screen failures? I think we do, if the records are there. What are the most common issues that sponsors have documented in their studies correctly? I think that's a tougher question because, we're, in this case presentation, we're talking about particular clinical trial sites, right? So the folks that are doing the site. The translation between that and the sponsors, or even like the CRO, it becomes a little different, and it's a different conversation. So from my perspective and from OSIS perspective, the data that the sponsor submits as part of an application is not something that, we look at it, but it's not something that we contemplate or inspect, especially when we're looking at a clinical trial site, if that's helpful. How many studies would you review before considering a generalized issue? It depends, right? It depends on the site. Like they may have only done one, and that it's meaningful, or they've done hundreds, and then maybe we'll take a lot more. I don't think there's a number, because it's going to be relatable to the kind of the issue that we're finding, and then the pattern and practice of that particular issue. So when a patient is, and I'm going to paraphrase, is ineligible, or if the consent is missing, is this an adverse event or a serious adverse event? Always reviewed when this occurs to see if the group is impacted. I think that's a harder question because it depends on the facts of the case. I think it's difficult to kind of, for me to take one nuanced hypothetical and answer in isolation, because I would look at the totality of what's going on at the particular site, what the actual issue is, what kind of study it is, what drug is involved, and the risks that are associated with it. So that's a pretty difficult question to answer, but I hope that kind of helps you get a glimpse of what goes into kind of contemplating that. In another question, it says, can a subject be withdrawn in one period due to an adverse event and be enrolled in a subsequent study period if the well-being is found okay before subsequent period? Again, I can't answer it in that narrow scenario. because again, it depends on the studies that are involved, the risks that are involved. But it is when you have one that's withdrawn and then rolls into another study or in a different period, it's something you would have to look at to dig a little deeper. Sometimes it's okay depending on the protocol and the risks in the study itself. Sometimes it's not. It's kind of tough to answer those questions in isolation. I think the last question I see here is for for a PK perspective, the PK population include all subjects with at least a dose and one sample collection. If inaccurate documentation, should the subject be excluded from PK? Or so the BABE PK review will be after documentation of the inspection? I think, let's take a step back. And I think it depends. Let's just say you go and inspect a PK study and you find some documentation issues. And I think you'd have to look at it again, like we look in the case studies. What is the documentation? Is it important? How important? Is there a pattern practice within that particular subject, or is it across multiple subjects? Is it significant enough for us to exclude the data generated for that visit or that missing aspect, or do we have to expand it to the entire subject, or do we expand it to the entire study? These are kind of issues that we contemplate, but the details matter in that scenario. I'm just scanning again. I see the last question. Can the sponsor side be inspected? Yes, they can. CROs changes names to avoid branding issues. Does FDA track that? Yes, we do. We do keep a track of who's who, and if they change names, we it's a big world, but we do a pretty good job in kind of keeping tabs on everything. So, all right. So I think I'm just taking a survey if there's any other big questions out there, but it looks like we are good to go. Thank you so much. I hope you guys have enjoyed this presentation as much as I've had. I've never done this format, so it's been kind of actually fun talking to myself. But again, if you have any other questions, send it forward to the OSIS office, and we can figure things out. But thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the day.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Pham, for the fantastic case presentations, and again to our audience for all the lively participation. We will now go ahead and